This is Tina. Tina lives in Scotland where life is not perfect, but is much the way we imagine a lot of families in modern Scotland. Tina is getting by the best she can in a mediocre and loveless marriage to Geoff. She often wonders if this is how it's going to be forever. As time goes on, Scotland begins to adopt stricter and stricter laws for women. They must give up their rights to drive a car, leave the house unaccompanied, and are made to dress in a veil. Geoff and other men become emboldened, physically, verbally, and sexually abusing the women in society, including Tina. One day, Tina finds that Geoff has given away their underage daughter to a much older man. Reaching her breaking point, Tina decides to strip naked and walk outside in defiance, wondering how far she would get. Our often visceral reaction to this story begs the question, do we feel this treatment is wrong merely because we are in present-day Scotland? Or is it because this treatment violates Tina and the other woman's universal human rights? First, we must examine the fundamental question, what are universal human rights? In 1948, after the atrocities of World War II, the United Nations came together to issue the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR. The document was the result of a collaboration of many different countries to define a list of fundamental universal human rights that we must protect and perhaps even promote. Essentially, believing in universal human rights means that you believe that all people, regardless of any denominator, have the same fundamental rights that must be protected. At first glance, this sounds pretty good, but over the years, this notion has been subjected to heavy criticism. Thus, we must ask, what are the problems with universal human rights? The main criticism is that universal human rights are a Western conception that is being pushed on other cultures without their approval or consent. These critics advocate for a cultural relativist approach instead. Cultural relativism is the belief that one should judge the beliefs, values, and practices of a culture from within the culture itself. For instance, when judging the practice of polygamy, a cultural relativist would not make a universal judgment that being married to multiple women is wrong, but instead judge the practice within each cultural and historical context. Therefore, we would not make sweeping judgments about rights across different cultures, but instead allow for our understanding of different cultures to influence our ideas about right and wrong. So, if there are all these problems with human rights talk, why should we not all be cultural relativists? There are many counter-arguments which should make us seriously question the cultural relativist position. Many of the critics of universal human rights argue that it is wrong because these are Western ideals and it's imperialistic to force these upon non-Western societies. This argument is flawed because the truth of the claim should not be judged based on its origin, but on the claim itself. This is called genetic fallacy. Just because universal human rights, or human dignity for that matter, are Western concepts, which I'm not sure they are, does not mean that they are any less true. Second, differences within cultures are also underestimated. Often there is a large dose of dissent against practices we may view as violating human rights. For instance, it is not true that an entire society accepts practices such as female genital mutilation. There are powerful movements that already exist within these societies.
In autumn, a tiny market town in central Pocot, a group of men and women are gathering to discuss how to replace cutting with an alternative rite of passage, which gives girls a chance to become women without being cut. This group is a grassroots self-help group called Kepsteno Rotwo, meaning abandon the knife.
The tendency to accept societies as homogeneous and in agreement with such practices does resistance movements a disservice and tends to paint the West as the only savior. In reality, culture is not a monolith. It is absolutely possible to find the people within a culture who disagree and empower them. Treating cultures as having homogeneous views often privileges the views of the majority at the expense of the minority.
Lastly, differences across cultures are exaggerated. We can often find an overarching principle to agree upon. In the video, we heard about the need for a rite of passage into womanhood. Looking strictly at this principle, which underlies FGM, are we not so different? Aren't bar mitzvahs, quinceañeras, and debutante balls centered around the same concept? At our core, we often find that people and their principles aren't actually that different after all. Without fully accepting the cultural relativist framework, we can still accept many of their critiques of universal human rights. For example, Mutua critiques universal human rights talk as being fundamentally Eurocentric, and thus leaving out a lot of other cultures and perspectives from the conversation. It pushes Western perceptions, beliefs, and values on other cultures without acknowledging the problems and human rights issues that also exist in Western countries. It is clear from Mutua's writing that there is a need for more inclusivity in the universal human rights movement. Looking at Tina in our gut, we may believe that there is something special about her, something special about all humans that deserve respect. Many philosophers describe this to be an inherent human dignity. Dignity is one of those words that seems to say a lot, but is very difficult to define. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines dignity as the quality or state of being worthy, honored, or esteemed. Human dignity has many qualities, which critics say make it ambiguous. Human dignity is inherent and not earned. It is inalienable in that we aren't given it. It is recognizable and deserves respect. Across human beings, dignity is equal, and yes, dignity is abstract. Now, where does this dignity come from? Is it because we have rational agency? Is it because we all share a set of capabilities? Or is it because if we all sat down at a table and talked about it, that's what would make the most sense? So what is rational agency, and why is it pertinent to this discussion of dignity? Rational agency, simply put, is the ability or capacity to set one's own ends or goals and plans. This rational agency is also referred to as autonomy. As Immanuel Kant says, autonomy is the ground of human nature and therefore of every rational nature. Individuals who believe that rationality and autonomy is essential to human dignity face the obstacle that not all humans possess rationality, like some infants, Alzheimer's patients, and individuals with disabilities. In effect, this argument ensures some people may be left out. Your gut may tell you that the treatment of Tina is wrong, not just because she's a rational being who can set her own ends, but also simply because she's a human deserving of respect. If this is the case, then the grounding of human rights and rationality is unacceptable. So now we seem to be right back where we started. We have rejected cultural relativism. We believe there are universal human rights that should encompass all people, but aren't quite sure how to ground them. We propose that we should look to Martha Nussbaum's ideas about capacities and collaboration to ground universal human rights. Martha Nussbaum asserts that the basic idea is that human beings have a worth that is indeed inalienable because of their capacities for various forms of activity and striving. If you remember, Kant also took a capacity-based approach to grounding dignity in human rights, but he only recognized the capacity for autonomy/rationality. Thinking back to Tina has a right to autonomy, but she also has a right to beneficence, which we can loosely define as the flourishing of a person. Nussbaum, unlike Kant, includes capabilities beyond rationality in her grounding of dignity. This is important because it broadens the people who can be considered to have human dignity. As Nussbaum says, refusing to ground dignity in rationality alone and insisting on grounding it in a varied set of capacities that are all elements in the life of a type of animal being, we can easily move forward to recognize that the world contains many different varieties of dignity, some human and some belonging to other species. Nussbaum argues for 10 capacities that she's determined through conversations with others to be necessary to live a dignified life. Most importantly, these capacities are not set in stone. They can evolve through conversations. Under Nussbaum's framework, conversations across cultures are encouraged and even required to figure out the minimal level of capabilities that an individual needs to live a dignified life in their society. This addresses many of the cultural relativist concerns by not considering culture and leaving others out of the conversation. The approach may not be perfect, as critics of a capacities-based approach may still say that you are grounding rights based on capacities and not based on an innate human quality. However, Nussbaum's framework is flexible in that it allows for a constant discourse to address those that may be inadvertently left out of the framework. So we are here. Human beings have dignity, and these are tied to a number of capabilities we each possess in some form and at some level. If we take this to be the case, it follows that these capabilities should be protected and promoted up to a sufficient level to live a dignified life. This framework is a call to action for the real world when thinking about human rights. Let's turn back to Tina one more time. Under Nussbaum's framework, Tina's treatment under Scotland's new laws is wrong because it deprives her of the capabilities necessary to live a dignified life. It would not matter in what country Tina lived in. If she lived in a country half a world away, cultural norms wouldn't shield this deprivation of her capabilities. She would in no current society have a sufficient level of the capabilities necessary to live a dignified life. If this framework was universally adopted, we would improve the lives of countless individuals as well as engage in more conversations across cultures. For us and for Nussbaum, the more we engage in these conversations, the stronger this framework will be.